peace in Messiah the Branch, and welcome to our study. The Sabbath Challenge in the Advent Movement. A Formal Response, Part 1. In the spirit of love, she is the living oracle of the true vine of Elohim. Her children are living branches, waving in the spirit of the wind. The spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Take heed, therefore, how you hear, is an admonition of Christ. Examine closely, prove all things. This is the counsel of God. Shall we heed it? From E.G. White. To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. From Psalm 11, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? David. From the pit of inspiration, from Great Controversy, she wrote, but Christians of past generations observed the Sunday, supposing that in doing so they were keeping the Bible Sabbath, and there are now true Christians in every church, not accepting the Roman Catholic communion, who honestly believe that Sunday is the Sabbath of divine appointment. God accepts their sincerity of purpose and their integrity before Him. But when Sunday observance shall be enforced by law, and the world shall be enlightened concerning the obligation of the true Sabbath, then whoever shall transgress the command of God to obey a precept which has no higher authority than that of Rome, will thereby honor popery above God. He is paying homage to Rome and to the power which enforces the institution ordained by Rome. He is worshiping the beast and his image. As men then reject the institution which God has declared to be the sign of His authority, and honor in its stead that which Rome has chosen as a token of her supremacy, they will thereby accept the sign of allegiance to Rome, the mark of the beast. And it is not until the issue is thus plainly set before the people, and they are brought to choose between the commandments of God and the commandments of men, that those who continue in transgression will receive the mark of the beast. When the test comes, it will be clearly shown that what the mark of the beast is. It is keeping of Sunday. The sign or seal of God is revealed in the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, the Lord's memorial of creation. The mark of the beast is the opposite of this, the observance of the first day of the week, Volume 8. And finally, in the issue of the contest, all Christendom will be divided into two great classes, those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, and those who worship the beast in his image and receive his mark. Although church and state will unite their power to compel all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive the mark of the beast, yet the people of God will not receive it. The prophet of Patmos beholds them that had gotten the victory over the beast and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass having the harps of God and singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. These statements of inspiration need no purification. They need no interpretation. They are clear and direct on this matter concerning the mark of the beast. Background history. Since the spring of 2011, the body of Messiah and the branch message have been confronted with a series of studies concerning the calendar of Rome, the Gregorian calendar change of 1582, versus the true calendar as it has been presented by Charles Pace at New Mount Carmel, Waco. Referencing primarily the inspired counsels of Victor Houteff in the Answer book, number 3, page 10 and 11, Following the first presentation and subsequent application of this purported new light concerning the true Sabbath, utilizing the yearly equinox of the fourth day of creation, those of us who were present at New Mount Carmel were of an honest spirit of investigation and testing to prove all things, hold fast that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5. We did not initially see the full extent and nature of this tremendous change until it began to further unfold over time. Weighty questions began to loom before several of us in view of the foundation of the Advent movement and of the clear counsels from the pen of inspiration. As Charles Pace further expounded on his purported true Sabbath teaching, even greater changes developed to the point that his determination of the true Sabbath day of creation week, supposedly, resulted in the keeping as sacred of the first day of the week on the Gregorian calendar, Sunday, calling it the actual true seventh day of creation week. Initially, it was taught Sunday was the true seventh day of creation week only temporarily and would change yearly based on the USNO timetables, or the United States Naval Observatory, the twilight times, being used to determine the natural equinox. Ultimately, in a surprising and self-contradictory move, Charles made the claim that the purported true Sabbath was determined to be the first day of the Gregorian calendar week perpetually, from history past to the present day, calling it the true seventh day of creation week. Presently, one of Charles' main core arguments is that the Roman Catholic Church perpetrated a kind of spiritual identity theft in a bold move to confuse and thus conceal the true history of the calendar and God's sacred timekeeping. In essence, he asserts that Rome has cleverly stolen and appropriated the true seventh day, claiming God's actual holy Sabbath day as her own, or covering it up as the first day, supposedly, and deceiving Sabbath keepers into observing a day that is a counterfeit of the true. It gets confusing, to say the least, even just to attempt to explain it. Let us examine the key points of this teaching according to what Victor Houteff presented in his essential study on the calendar in Answer Book and also in light of the Spirit of Prophecy counsels of Ellen White and others, as well as the historical record. It will be proven that not until this particular and singular challenge to the Sabbath teaching in the Advent movement has been developed and fully manifested in the Church can the statement of Ellen White that a group in the Church, not the whole Church, would proclaim the Sabbath more fully begin to be realized. Here is the full reference. And I saw that if God had changed the Sabbath from the seventh to the first day, he would have changed the writing of the Sabbath commandment, written on the tables of stone, which are now in the ark, in the most holy place of the temple in heaven. And it would read thus, "The first day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God." But I saw that it read the same as when written on the tables of stone by the finger of God, and delivered to Moses on Sinai. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. I saw that the Holy Sabbath is and will be the separating wall between the true Israel of God and unbelievers, and that the Sabbath is the great question to unite the hearts of God's dear waiting saints. I saw that God had children who did not see and keep the Sabbath. They had not rejected the light upon it. And at the commencement of the time of trouble, we were filled with the Holy Ghost as we went forth and proclaimed the Sabbath more fully. This enraged the churches and nominal Adventists, as they could not refute the Sabbath truth. And at this time, God's chosen all saw clearly that we had the truth, and they came out and endured the persecution with us. I saw the sword, famine, pestilence, and great confusion in the land. The wicked thought that we had brought the judgments upon them, and they rose up and took counsel to rid the earth of us, thinking that then the evil would be stayed. Response to Charles and Alexa Pace. I come to you in the name of the branch and in the spirit of love to ask your prayerful consideration of the separating wall that your current Sabbath position has erected between us. I am praying and hoping for a resolution, a reconsideration on your part of your position on the Sabbath and sacred calendar. I presented my concerns on this topic in another study to you over a year ago, with extensive statements from the pen of inspiration. Margaret Tao also wrote you a similar letter. Charles, around the same time. Together, Margaret, my wife Linda, and I recently shared with you both a more extensive study on the continuous Sabbath and sacred history. Once more, I am coming to you under the solemn authority of the Matthew 18 injunction. Please do not take this lightly. Charles, I am saddened that I must now address the various claims and charges that you brought before the people in your various recent YouTube study to answer the Sabbath question. In regards to Margaret, Linda, and myself, of particular note, these charges include the notion that by quoting the prophets, the inspired founders of the Advent movement, we are simply parroting the words of the prophets and thus worshiping at their tombs, practicing Shintoism. Spiritually, that we are being faithful Laodiceans by respecting the foundation laid in regards to the key historical teachings on the Sabbath. Are we to conclude from your accusations that the words of inspiration are meaningless to you in their obvious simplicity and directness? How can we conclude otherwise from your response? As I address the various points you covered in your video study, I will particularly address your key statement from the Answer Book 3. You have accused us of not being willing to address this statement, supposedly because of its clarity to your position. We agree that this statement and the study from which it is taken quite clearly provide the truth of this whole controversy. We also agree that a true branch will believe in the undoubted inspiration of Victor Houteff, as well as Ben and Lois Roden. I feel that before beginning, I need to say something about the Isaiah 7 prophecy of the Emmanuel, who eats the butter and honey, and to whom you repeatedly make reference in your various studies. The verses referenced in Isaiah 7 read, verse 14, Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. And it shall come to pass in that day that a man shall nourish a young cow and 2 sheep. And it shall come to pass for the abundance of milk that they shall give, he shall eat butter, for butter and honey shall everyone eat that is left in the land. These verses have been cited by you in reference to yourself, Charles, since the time of the 1993 judgment at New Mount Carmel. In the past, I agreed with your prophetic application, seeing it in a sequential application until the coming of the righteous harvest of the son and the daughter after the marriage. I need to make a point in the light of your current Sabbath position. The key operative word that must be considered first and foremost in the identity of the individual applying a present truth application to the Isaiah 7 prophecy is the word nourish. One must consider the word nourish in full respect of Brother Houteff's application in track number 6. I think it's track 6. In view of the extensive spirit of prophecy statements on the Sabbath, the defining of the mark of the beast in relation to Sunday sacredness, and your present challenge to the historically continuous Sabbath of creation, I contend that the present truth application of Isaiah 7:21 prophecy must be applied to someone that can and does truly nourish the young cow and 2 sheep. When we look at the dictionary definition of the word nourish, a clear picture emerges as to the significance of this one word in relation to the Isaiah prophecy. Let us consider from the Merriam-Webster dictionary this key word. If the Jesuits had the incredible foresight to tamper with the definition of this word in particular, well, such tampering would not support your position here. I will spend a full page, probably over a page, just in considering of this critical word, since it applies to a key prophecy in the rod and branch movements, and it is most significant for identifying what is transpiring in the Sabbath challenge controversy in the branch. From Merriam-Webster, nourish, a transitive verb, described as nurture, rear, to promote growth of, to furnish or sustain with nutriment. Examples of nourish: vitamins are added to the shampoo to nourish the hair. Our friendship is nourished by trust. Origin of nourish. Skipping down here, related to nourish. Synonyms: advance, cultivate, encourage, forward, further, incubate, foster, nurse, nurture, promote. Antonyms: discourage, frustrate, hinder, inhibit. Related words: advocate, back, champion, endorse, support, uphold, endow, finance, etc. You get the idea. Near antonyms: ban, bar, enjoin, forbid, interdict, outlaw, prevent, prohibit, etc. In the related words section of the word nourish above, we read advocate, back, champion, endorse, support, uphold, etc. I will pick just one word here from this list that best conflicts with your application of the manual for today, and that word is support. I could easily use more than a dozen of these related words and synonyms for the word nourish throughout this study, and frankly I will, to support my position on this Sabbath challenge and to clearly support Spirit of Prophecy definitions, some of which I've already read. Charles, my question to you is, does your use of the various Spirit of Prophecy statements in play in this controversy, the ones that I have quoted above in particular, and will quote throughout this study, support your application of the Sabbath change? The clear context and wording of the Spirit of Prophecy statements presented here as identifying the mark of the beast, the true Sabbath versus the spurious Sabbath of Rome, is the central question here. The Isaiah 7 prophecy of the Emmanuel, the one who is supposed to nourish the young cow and 2 sheep, must support what the various inspired statements are actually saying in plain English. Look at the antonyms of the word nourish. We can apply every antonym of the word nourish to the overall application you make in promoting your Sabbath change in relation to any of the Spirit of Prophecy statements on the mark of the beast and the spurious Sabbath. Anyone outside of Mount Carmel would look at your application of the Spirit of Prophecy statements and determine that your new Sabbath teaching does in fact frustrate, hinder, inhibit, and a few other words, the various statements of inspiration, including Victor Houteff and Ben and Lois Roden. Hence, your current position on the Sabbath does not nourish the young cow and 2 sheep. Considering all of the synonyms cited above, advance, cultivate, encourage, forward, further, etc., can you honestly tell us that your application of the purported true Sabbath, let's face it, it is Sunday sacredness in verity, actually harmonizes with any of the synonyms for nourish to support the symbolic young cow, the Spirit of Prophecy, the writings of Ellen White, and the two sheep, the Old and New Testament. The word harmonize, in conjunction with support, must be used in this example. These two words are directly related conceptually. I will bear down hard, very hard on this point, Charles, because your position does not harmonize with the inspired statements, nor with the Torah, the Tanakh, or with the commentaries or historical literature. Does your position advocate, back, champion, endorse, support, uphold, etc. any of Ellen White's or Victor Houghton's inspired statements? With the clear and direct words on the Sabbath in the historical record, with the enforcement of the spurious Sabbath Sunday in the prophetic application, that being Sunday laws, let each one be persuaded in his own mind on this matter. You see, Charles, I am wary of anyone who takes these inspired statements to spin them around violently, to turn them on their head, so to speak, to totally countermand their common dictionary meaning, to totally violate our otherwise good etymological sensibilities on such matters, to tell us that we are blind Laodiceans because we will not accept a nonsensical and insupportable application that purports to us that the first day of the week is actually the true seventh day, to allege somehow that Ellen White and all the pioneer fathers and all the prophets of the Advent movement miss this truth, that the Advent movement has been observing the actual spurious Sabbath since 1846, to allege that the Jesuits set up Ellen White or influenced her or changed her writings and changed the history books. Really now, Ellen White, a Jesuit? This would be laughable if it were not so blatantly pathetic. Very sad. Very unbelievable. Has the Sabbath truth been polluted? Yes, it has. Does true Sabbath keeping need to be restored in the Advent movement? Yes. The Sabbath needs to be proclaimed more fully, not completely changed to support the Roman observance and to avoid the inevitable persecution that comes to all those who would live righteously in Christ Jesus by keeping the true Sabbath. But to tell the whole Advent movement that we have been misled for over 160 years and have actually been led into keeping of the spurious Sabbath, Saturday, supposedly, by the accepted and accredited spirit of prophecy, which laid the foundation of the whole movement, that the Roman Church scholars worked to make the Advent movement in 1846 believe a new spurious Sabbath via Joseph Bates and James and Ellen White, supposedly all Jesuit infiltrators, that Rome and apostate Protestantism are the true victors in this great controversy over the identity of the true Sabbath, that Sabbath-keeping Adventists are veritable fools in this Sabbath controversy. When all is said and done and revealed, without a shred of evidence to support your allegations, well, I say this is well outside the pale of reason, sensibility, and truth. But, Charles, this allegation is exactly what you are asking the people to embrace on your word alone. What do you do with the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets? In essence, you are saying that you yourself are the only true prophet to come on the scene in the Advent movement, because all of the forerunners were wrong on this central truth? Really, this is what you are saying. The Bible does not seem to actually reveal anything about this issue of the continuous Sabbath, since it was never challenged in the Scriptures by anyone, not even Yeshua. See Hebrews 4, verses 1 through 10, where Paul speaks of the Sabbath day remaining. The Roman Catholic establishment hasn't lodged any complaint that Sunday is not being recognized as the true Sabbath, but instead acknowledges Saturday as the true biblical Sabbath. But But scriptural prophecy does declare that the man of sin would think to change times and laws, Daniel 7, thus evidencing an outright change in the times and laws of the continuous Seventh-day Sabbath and the festal Sabbaths. As one can read in multiple historical sources, the Western pagan calendar systems adopted the existing 7-day cycle of the Jews because it was already in place since creation, making it more sensible, more workable than their own false calendar systems. The original 7-day cycle was much older than any new development of the calendar in the pagan world, and the calendar historians all agree on this adoption of the Jews' 7-day cycle. Several of us who have carefully studied this topic over the last 2 years, and in the face of the Sabbath challenge from New Mount Carmel, now call the historical Sabbath of the Advent movement adopted from Judaism the continuous Sabbath of creation. 2 divine institutions from creation, 2 laws. From the pen of inspiration, in Eden, the marriage law and the Sabbath law were plainly and distinctly defined, that there might be no ignorance or misleading on the part of the people. When God had finished the work of creation, he rested on the 7th day. He blessed the day of his rest while the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Then marriage and the Sabbath had their origin, twin institutions for the glory of God in the benefit of humanity. Then, as the Creator joined the hands of the holy pair in wedlock, he enunciated the law of marriage for all the children of Adam to the close of time. That which the Eternal Father himself had pronounced good was the law of highest blessing and development for man. Like every other one of God's good gifts, entrusted to the keeping of humanity, marriage has been perverted by sin, but it is the purpose of the gospel to restore its purity and beauty. In the beginning, there were 2 institutions given from the Creator to the first man and the first woman, who represented all humanity. These 2 institutions were marriage and the Sabbath. We now clearly see direct challenges to both institutions in the progression of the Advent movement, most particularly in the 3rd section of the Advent movement, the branch. Why is this? The branch has the most light and is accountable first in the judgment of the living. This accountability precipitated the first providential judgment on the movement on April 19, 1993. Vernon Howell, David Koresh made a law in the branch annulling the marriage institution and taking the wives of his married members to be joined with himself in a polygamous union contrary to Torah. David Koresh taught a seemingly logical and otherwise practical application of what all Christianity teaches, including the SDA Church, that Christ, the Son, marries the church, meaning he marries the church members, which are in reality only his children, both male and female. But in the branch, we know that this is a false teaching. Inspiration states that the church members are guests at the marriage. We are not the bride. This, according to Ellen White, Great Controversy 427. Charles, in the last 2.5 years, you have made a law at New Mount Carmel to eradicate the historical and continuous Sabbath of creation. In the past, you have essentially taught that the purification of the movement, the branch, was complete in 1993. But according to Victor Houteff, Ben Roden, and Ellen White, the mark of the beast must first appear in the church before it can occur in the world. The evidence of the mark of the beast is the law, Sunday law, to enforce Sunday observance. And none of this happened under Vernon Howell. Sister Roden was deeply perplexed by both Vernon's teaching and your teachings, Charles. She even went so far as to say you were each saying the same things in different ways, like two sides of the same coin. And yes, Charles, you did teach a significant portion of truth, and you did provide good counsel to Sister Roden at the time. But I remember very well her words and her perplexity. My point here is that if your current teaching on the Sabbath, placing it on the first day of the Gregorian calendar week, is correct, then, in the parity of application and parity of duality of both the Sabbath and marriage institutions, twin institutions, you would also have some new and conclusive teaching to redefine the institution of marriage as well. But perhaps Vernon's move to eradicate the marriage institution of creation was sufficient. At least I hope so. Remember, the Sabbath and marriage institutions go together. They must stand together or they must fall together, as will all the law, all of the Torah, and the Ten Commandments. In light of the teaching at New Mount Carmel, Joshua has the authority to loose and bind, ostensibly at will, in effect, directing the will of heaven on both of these institutions. It is interesting to note that in 1846, just after the Sabbath truth was presented in the group study of truth seekers, the small band of Advent believers, the priesthood of believers, and confirmed to Sister White in vision, according to the historical narrative in early writings, then Ellen Harmon and James White were joined in marriage. So we see, even in the history of the early Advent movement, that the institutions of marriage and the Sabbath were in close sequence to each other. Here are the words of inspiration on this topic. There were two institutions founded in Eden that were not lost in the fall, the Sabbath and the marriage relation. These were carried by man beyond the gates of paradise. He who loves and observes the Sabbath and maintains the purity of the marriage institution thereby proves himself the friend of man and the friend of God. He who, by precept or example, lessens the obligation of these sacred institutions is the enemy of both God and man, and is using his influence and his God-given talents to bring in a state of confusion and moral corruption. Charles, notice here, lessening the obligation of either of these divine institutions brings a state of confusion and moral corruption. Particularly when we attempt to explain what you teach, that the true seventh day is actually the first day of the week, and Rome covered that up and then set up a spurious Sabbath in 1846 for the Advent movement. It's too complicated to really even explain short of several paragraphs, and frustrating, to say the least. She goes on to say here, the marriage institution was made in Eden. The Sabbath of the fourth commandment was instituted in Eden, when the foundations of the world were laid, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Then let this, God's institution of marriage, stand before you as firm as the Sabbath of the fourth commandment. 10. The Sabbath of the Lord. While on a visit to New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1846, I became acquainted with Elder Joseph Bates. He had early embraced the Advent faith and was an active laborer in the cause. I found him to be a true Christian gentleman, courteous and kind. The first time he heard me speak, he manifested deep interest. After I had ceased speaking, he arose and said, I am a doubting Thomas. I do not believe in visions. But if I could believe that the testimony the sister has related tonight was indeed the voice of God to us, I should be the happiest man alive. My heart is deeply moved. I believe the speaker to be sincere, but cannot explain in regard to her being shown the wonderful things she has related to us. Elder Bates was resting upon Saturday, the seventh day of the week, and he urged it upon our attention as the true Sabbath. I did not feel its importance, and thought that he erred in dwelling upon the fourth commandment more than upon the other 9. But the Lord gave me a view of the heavenly sanctuary. The temple of God was open in heaven, and I was shown the Ark of the Covenant, with the mercy seat. 2 angels stood, one at either end of the ark, with their wings spread over the mercy seat, and their faces turned toward it. This, my accompanying angel informed me, was represented all the heavenly host looking with reverential awe toward the law of God, which had been written by the finger of God. Jesus raised the cover of the ark, and I beheld the tables of stone on which the 10 Commandments were written. I was amazed as I saw the 4th commandment in the very center of the 10 precepts, with a soft halo of light encircling it. Said the angel, "It is the only one of the 10 which defines the living God, who created the heavens and the earth and all things that are therein." When the foundations of the earth were laid, then was also laid the foundation of the Sabbath. I was shown that if the true Sabbath had been kept, there would never have been an infidel or an atheist. The observance of the Sabbath would have preserved the world from idolatry. She states this, of course, in a general sense, because she also says, in great controversy, that there were always true Sabbath keepers throughout history. So it was never covered up, never hidden. Further, she says here, the 4th commandment has been trampled upon. Therefore, we are called upon to repair the breach in the law and plead for the desecrated Sabbath. Plead for the desecrated Sabbath. The man of sin who exalted himself above God and thought to change times and laws brought about the change of the Sabbath, from the 7th to the 1st day of the week. In doing this, he made a breach in the law of God. Just prior to the great day of God, a message is sent forth to warn the people to come back to their allegiance to the law of God, which Antichrist has broken down. Attention must be called to the breach in the law by precept and example. I was shown that the precious promises of Isaiah 58 apply to those who labor for the restoration of the true Sabbath. I was shown that the 3rd angel proclaiming the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus represents the people who received this message and raised the voice of warning to the world to embrace the commandments of God and His law as the apple of His eye, and that in response to this warning, many would embrace the Sabbath of the Lord. And in sequence here, Point 11, Marriage and United Labors, August 30, 1846. I was united in marriage to Elder James White. Elder White had enjoyed a deep experience in the Advent movement, and his labors in proclaiming the truth had been blessed of God. Our hearts were united in the great work, and together we traveled and labored for the salvation of souls. By what you're teaching, Charles, all of these above statements, this whole single statement in sequence, was polluted, even completely false. That's what you're asking the people to believe. There are some of us today who now labor for the restoration of the true Sabbath that has been made void at New Mount Carmel by a law, a teaching which constitutes the spiritual mark of the beast. As Brother Hoddif and Brother Roden first taught, first in the church, then in the world, one being a miniature representation of the latter. There has now been fulfilled a breach in the law of God within the Advent movement, pertaining to both the marriage and the Sabbath institutions of the 10 Commandments. We had always believed this event would be introduced in the Mother Church, in mainstream Adventism, and not touch us in the branch, the 3rd section of the Advent movement. Now, Isaiah 58 can be applied to the Advent movement in a final and climactic application. It could first be applied at the beginning of the Advent movement, when the true and continuous Sabbath of creation was restored. and now in this third section of the movement. Of course, Ellen White applies this application of Isaiah 58 at the beginning of the movement in the preceding statement. Response to the central statement. Here is Brother Hoddif's statement in Answer Book 3, and I'll just read straight through it before commenting on it. When does the Hebrew year begin? Question number 50. Can you tell us the Hebrew New Year's Day and the days of their sacred feasts in terms of our Roman calendar? Answer. While leading the Hebrew host from bondage to freedom, the Lord was firmly establishing them in the truth of all things, including the truth on the day on which the year begins, of the day on which the month begins, and of the day on which the week begins. Obviously, the Hebrew religion had largely to do with the days of the week, of the month, and of the year. The Hebrews were forever to keep holy, one, not a seventh, but the seventh day of each week, the Sabbath. Two, the days from the 15th to the 21st day of the first month, the Passover week. Three, the 15th or the 50th day of the sheaf of the first fruits was offered. The Pentecost. 4, the 10th day of the 7th month, the Atonement. 5, the days from the 15th to the 21st day of the same month, the Feast of Tabernacles. And 6, the Feast of the New Moons. Thus, the all-knowing one, he who created the heavenly bodies and knows the very moment he set them in motion to govern the day, the month, and the year, note, not the weekly cycle, decreed that the holy feasts be observed in the very month and on the very day on which they were first ordained. And he appointed the lights in the firmament for signs and for seasons and for days and years, by the movements of which he fixed each solar and lunar date, so that it could never be lost sight of. Then, to make doubly secure against such a loss, he spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year unto you. Thus we see that his great and never-erring timepiece for earth, the earth's own invariable movements, fix the day and the year, whereas the moon's revolving round the earth makes the months. But the Roman New Year, January 1, finds its establishment not in the movements of the solar system, but in the notions of mythology. Consequently, as the date does not coincide with either the vernal or the autumnal equinox, or with either the summer or the winter solstice, then should Earth's inhabitants ever lose count of the day and need to recover it, they would be helpless to do so. To prevent his people from bringing upon themselves such a catastrophe, and to have them intelligent as to the time the year begins, the Lord gave to Moses the sacred yearly calendar, which cannot be lost or miscalculated so long as the earth remains. He told him that the day which preceded the Exodus was the 14th day of the first month, and that forever thereafter they were to commemorate the Passover on the very night each year, the night following the 14th day. Thus was the Lord reestablishing the creation calendar, reaffirming that the year begins on the day of the vernal equinox, on which spring, the first season of the year, commences, and on which the sun and the moon were created, the fourth day from the beginning of creation. The only point in time in which the very nature of things, the year, could begin. Note, no reference to the weekly cycle yet. And so it is that the Passover, the Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, the three most important feasts in the year, besides other feasts, were controlled by the solar year and by the lunar month, semicolon. The weekly Sabbath on the day, by the day, on which creation began, semicolon, and the year itself by the vernal equinox, the immovable signpost. Brother Hoddif uses semicolons throughout the statement, but I emphasize these last two to make a point on the next page. There is a great deal going on here in this quotation by Brother Hoddif in presenting the true calendar principles. First of all, please notice that I do not use any distracting highlight colors in the above quotation. The extensive and varying highlight colors you use in your video study, Charles, are very distracting and disorienting for the reader, rendering it difficult to really look at what the statement is presenting. Let us just read the statement for what it says, and most of all, what it does not say. I have simply bolded and underlined the key sentences for emphasis. There are only two sentences in the statement that deal with the seventh-day Sabbath. Brother Hoddif is clearly summarizing Leviticus 23. We need to do a brief summary. Notice, he is dealing with mainly the yearly cycle based upon the immovable signpost equinoxes. And in one very brief sentence at the end, he clearly notes the weekly cycle and how it is to begin or to be determined. He is dealing mostly with the yearly solar cycle and the determination of the yearly feasts. Since nowhere in the statement by Brother Hoddif does he tie the weekly cycle to the yearly cycle, we must be very careful not to assume that we can use the equinox, any equinox, however defined, to establish the weekly cycle or the Sabbath. He clearly states, the weekly Sabbath by the day on which creation began. I repeat, the weekly Sabbath by the day on which creation began. This phrase obviously points to the first day of the creation week. This is the only statement in the whole quote that deals with this weekly Sabbath, and there is not the slightest hint of using any other way to determine it other than from the first day of creation, day 1, the day that light was created. Apart from any natural light source or the equinox of the fourth day of creation. Since Brother Hoddif states that the weekly cycle is counted from the day on which creation began, we can only logically conclude that the Creator's weekly cycle is the same weekly cycle in use today, thus being continuous. In fact, the Rod makes this very statement in dealing with the lunar Sabbath theory, yet this statement is correlative and parallel to the solar equinox theory that you are applying to the seventh day, Charles. Here's what Brother Hoddif says in the symbolic code. He says, in the preceding quoted paragraphs, the well-intentioned but grossly misinformed author is attempting to overthrow the seventh-day Sabbath by ignoring the original weekly cycle. Now he's God's septenary cycle of creation, and by setting up in its place a moon-controlled septenary cycle of his own devising, so as to make the 7th, the 14th, the 21st, and the 28th days of each lunar month commemorative Sabbaths of the week of creation. It is true that the names of the months and the days of the week are of mythological origin, but the cycle of the week, as we shall see, is from time immemorial. Again, but the cycle of the week, as we shall see, is from time immemorial. True, the Lord said to Moses, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. But he did not say, it shall be the beginning of weeks to you. Thus the question, how readest thou, sharply confronts the lunar Sabbath author for answer. Plainly, God could not have said, "This moon shall be the beginning of weeks to you," for such a course would be, as we shall see, contrary to nature, scripture, and logic. Had he intended the moon to fix the time of the holy Sabbath, he would have make it complete its revolution around the earth once, either in exactly 4 weeks or in exactly 1 week. But since the moon does not do so, it cannot be taken as the divine regulator of the weekly holy Sabbath day. Moreover, Sabbath begins at even, whereas the new moon may appear at any hour of day or night. The following paragraphs briefly bring forth solar, lunar, and biblical facts, not implications, that the weekly cycle never has been and never can be controlled by any lunar or solar calendar, and that the Church, under direction, has never either in Old or New Testament kept a lunar Sabbath. The Sabbath which the Lord hallowed was celebrated on exactly the 7th day after the creation of the earth began, not on the 7th day after the creation of the moon began. So the weekly cycle which God set in motion and the Sabbath which he himself celebrated were not measured by the revolutions of the moon, but by the revolutions of the earth. Had the Lord blessed and observed the Sabbath that is governed by the moon, then the Sabbath day could not have fallen on the 7th day from the beginning of creation, but rather must have fallen within the 10th day, for the moon was not created and set in motion until after the 4th day of creation. Since the week was not then governed by the moon, it certainly cannot be governed by it now and still be the week of creation. As the creation was 3 days older, as the creation week was 3 days older than both the sun and the moon, the fact conclusively follows, therefore, that neither of these heavenly luminaries could have ever regulated the week of creation. Moreover, such a lunar regulatory force would, except it be in cycles of 10, deprive time and creation of the first 3 days, leaving them as a phantom lost period. The week is a period of 7 days, having no reference whatsoever to celestial motions, a circumstance to which it owes its unalterable uniformity. It was employed from time immemorial in almost all Eastern countries, and, as it forms neither an aliquot part of the year nor of the lunar month, those who reject the Mosaic recital will be at a loss, as Delambre remarks, to assign it an origin having such semblance of possibility. Encyclopedia Britannica, quoted by Victor Houteff. He says here, the week is a period of 7 days having no reference whatsoever to celestial motions, a circumstance to which it owes its unalterable uniformity. That would include the equinox, I would say. Finally, he says here, there is history's testimony. Plainly, it no more supports the lunar Sabbath author's claims than do logic and scripture. On the contrary, it reveals that the present Roman week, take note, is the same as the ancient Jewish and Christian week, that it has been and still is the world's week from time immemorial, from creation. This week, moreover, explains in Encyclopedia Britannica, is a period of 7 days having no reference whatsoever to the celestial motions. It couldn't be any plainer than that. If the equinox is used as a continuous year-by-year signpost for the true creation week and the 7th-day Sabbath, it is no different from the use of the moon to establish the week and the month made by the lunar Sabbath adherents. Such an act essentially ignores the directive of Exodus 12:1-2, which pinpoints the month of Abib on the Egyptian solar calendar as the beginning of months for the Hebrews. The statement of Brother Hadaf, the Genesis 1 account, and Leviticus 23 clearly show us that the weekly Sabbath was completely independent of all other determinations for the feast of the Lord. It might seem logical to use the equinox every year for a signpost to determine the fourth day of creation week, and then count to the seventh day 3 days later, but nowhere in the rod statement does he give such an example. It is a step of presumption to leap to this conclusion. It is also a presumption that the weekly cycle was ever lost to sacred history, in complete contradiction to direct statements made by inspiration and to the evidence of the historical record. It is one thing to say that the Jews and the Israelites forgot the Sabbath, or rather polluted it and disregarded it. But it is a whole other matter to say they actually lost track of it, or worse yet, that the Creator took the Sabbath from them. Would he really deceive and deprive his faithful remnant of the true Sabbath because of the betrayal of the unfaithful? The Sabbath day is a covenant the faithful have in our relationship with the Creator, as binding as the marriage covenant. The Creator has never broken his part of the covenant. If the Creator did so, then neither the faithful or the unfaithful could be held responsible for the violation of the seventh-day Sabbath. The Jews and the 10 tribes polluted and violated the Sabbath day rebelliously, worshiping on the day of the sun, Sunday, although it wasn't known as Sunday at the time, in conjunction with their pagan contemporaries. If you are right about Sabbath being on the first day of the Gregorian calendar week, or Sunday, which you claim is actually the seventh day of the creation week, then the Jews were engaged in the keeping of the apostate Sabbath, Saturday, before and during the time of Christ, a concept for which there is zero scriptural evidence. One cannot pollute an apostate Sabbath. One can only pollute the true Sabbath. Here from the symbolic code, every Bible student knows that the seventh day of the week is the Sabbath, that it alone is holy and commemorative of God's creation. Then, too, the whole civilized world knows that Sunday is the first day of the week. And not a few know that it was originally a pagan festal day in honor of the mythical god of the sun. The fact thus follows that the day preceding it, Saturday, is the seventh day, the holy Sabbath of creation. In this day of increased knowledge, all this adds up to the stark reality that to attempt to set up another day for the Sabbath is in itself supreme idolatry, blasphemy, and contempt directly against the Most Holy Himself. Do these statements need any interpretation? This same principle is displayed and carried through in the Ezekiel 4 time chart, showing the pollution of the Sabbath truth. Yet, of particular note is the fact that where the 3 angels' messages are given on said chart, they are shown without any dots or flecks. Brother Hadaf used the dots or flecks to represent polluted doctrine. The pollution came with the observance, application, and teaching of these truths by uninspired teachers and leaders after the foundational truths were given in their purity by the prophets at the beginning of each movement. In fact, Charles, all of the foundational truths were given to the individual prophets of each movement in the SDA Church in a state of purity by the heavenly author, a fact represented, as anyone can see from the chart by the placement of all the truths in one vessel, the first circle that is free from dots. This is plain to see below on the Ezekiel prophecy chart by Victor Hodoff. Here is the first vessel all these truths are brought together with, and the second vessel that has been purified. Yet we can see in the first vessel all these truths, including the three angels' message, the Sabbath and the sanctuary truths, both vessels connected, were given in their purity. How could Jesuits have countered these truths or been involved in their presentation? The chart doesn't lie. In Brother Hodoff's explanation of the Ezekiel 4 chart, he makes some very interesting explanatory comments. The question may be asked, how have we polluted God's truth? Only one of the many references will be quoted here. Volume 1, pages 471, 472. A great mistake has been made by some who profess present truth. By introducing merchandise in the course of a series of meetings, ministers have stood in the desk and preached a most solemn discourse, and then by introducing merchandise and acting the part of a salesman, even in the house of God, the burden of selling our publication should not rest upon ministers who labor in word and doctrine. Volume 8, page 250. I saw our instructor Christ pointing to the garments of so-called righteousness. Stripping them off, he laid bare the defilement beneath. Then he said to me, can you not see how they have pretentiously covered up their defilement and rottenness of character? How the faithful city has become a harlot? My Father's house is made a house of merchandise, a place where the divine presence and glory have departed. For this cause there is weakness and strength is lacking. Thus we have proof that every truth thus far has been polluted, including the Sabbath. Shepherd's Rod, Volume 1. The question is, why was not the seventh portion included in this prophecy? Because the six were polluted, defiled with man's preparations, man's thoughts and plans, have been interjected and followed, which in God's sight were as dung. It is not to be so with the seventh, for it is the last, it must be pure. The city, Jerusalem, is God's church, namely the Seventh-day Adventist, Israel. God himself organized this church by a prophet, and there is a great deal of difference between the church and the churches during the Reformation from Luther's time onward. Those who sigh and cry for the abominations that are done in the church will be sealed by the man with the writer's inkhorn. Those who are determined to do evil, that is, do contrary to the rules laid down by the Spirit of God through the testimonies of the church, will be destroyed by the 5 men with the slaughter weapons of Ezekiel 9. He says here, God himself organized this church by a prophet. But you're telling us, Charles, it was organized by the Jesuits. Add to these comments another from his study on Zechariah 4. Therefore, any theory or so-called truth that might have been advanced by some within the SDA denomination that had not been revealed prior to 1890 is also false. Though some things were written in the spirit of prophecy, they were not to be understood until 1929. The truths revealed prior to 1844 and up to 1929 are found in the writings of the spirit of prophecy, and that which is not written there is of no value. Find your explanations in the bowl, and you will have no trouble in knowing the truth or avoiding the ever-ready trap of deception. Thus, the difficulty in knowing the difference between truth and error is eliminated. We notice in this statement, he says, to get our truths from the golden bowl. Please define what you mean, Charles, by golden bowl. And I hope it's in harmony and supports and nourishes what Brother Hoddif has just stated here of what constitutes the Golden Bowl. Brother Hoddif has explained Inspiration's stance on this quote quite well. A summary of certain grammatical facts. 1. That is in relation to his statement in Answer Book 3, where he uses quite a few semicolons. The use of the semicolon reveals the separation of thoughts in each clause or phrase, semicolon. While the comma is frequently used, the following are the general accepted rules for the use of the semicolon. A. To separate two independent thoughts in a sentence that otherwise would have been separated by using a conjunction such as and or but. 2. In view of the grammatical rule stated above, that the semicolon separates two or more independent thoughts, we need to rightly divide the whole statement with each semicolon that Brother Hoddif inserts. Each sentence in the 3 answer book statement is an independent thought. Some statements harmonize when dealing with the yearly solar time of the feast, yet the one statement near the end concerning the weekly cycle is not part of the same time element. That is, in the application of the equinox. Brother Hoddif states clearly that the 7th day of creation week is determined from the day on which creation began, thus indicating a continuous weekly cycle, and that the 7th day Sabbath has never been lost or hidden. The spirit of prophecy adamantly indicates that there have always been faithful ones throughout the ages that have kept the 7th day Sabbath of creation. And it was well known what day they kept in the historical record. We can use the conjunction of but when he comments on the weekly Sabbath. Yet we can use the word and with the other statements when dealing with the yearly feasts, since those separate statements harmonize with the yearly time element. Here again Brother Hoddif states, apparently quoting Ellen White, in this first one, like the Sabbath, the week originated at creation, and it has been preserved and brought down to us through Bible history. God measured off the first week as a sample for successive weeks to the close of time. Like every other, it consisted of several literal days. There is history's testimony. Plainly, it no more supports the lunar Sabbath author's claims than do logic and scripture. On the contrary, it reveals that the present Roman week is the same as the ancient Jewish and Christian week, that it has been and still is the world's week from time immemorial, from creation. The week, moreover, explains, Encyclopedia Britannica is a period of 7 days having no reference whatsoever to the celestial motions. It's symbolic code 13, which of course bears repeating. Charles, these are not our words, but the words of inspiration, clear, direct, simple, and quite certain in this matter. 3. The weekly cycle of creation must remain separate from the yearly solar cycle in their respective determinations. It might seem logical at first to use the equinox to confirm the 4th day of creation week, and then count 3 days later to the 7th day, Sabbath, but no actual example is given of this in Scripture. Brother Hoddif does not in the least tie the two time systems together. History shows that the weekly cycle and the yearly cycle have always been independent of each other. This is the end of part 1. Thank you for your attention.